BBC Sounds.
Strange happened in Malmö in Sweden at the end of October 2018. A packet of chewing gum caused a small-scale riot. And here, according to the news, is what happened.
Mahler's Fifth Symphony has been hailed as a transforming experience and the composer's love letter to his new bride. Sadly,
the harmony at a recent performance in Sweden didn't extend to everyone in the audience. Some concert-goers came to blows in a row over rustling sweet papers.
He grabbed her bag and threw it to the ground next to him. Onlookers said the woman waited until the performance had finished before taking revenge. She reportedly slapped him so hard his glasses fell off. The man who was with her then started throwing punches at the bag snatcher.
Mahler's Adagietto from his Fifth Symphony, the fourth movement of that piece, was indeed composed as a love letter to his wife Alma, and it's one of Gustav's most tender utterances. It's also one of his quietest. But in Malmö, just to repeat that in case you thought your ears were deceiving you, a lady opened her chewing gum, a man next to her took the packet away and threw it to the ground in disgust at the noise she was making. And then after the finale, which is much, much louder than this music, she slapped him. And Malmö's concert hall was the scene of musical fisticuffs as his mates got stuck in too. Now, this could have happened anywhere around the world. Anywhere, that is, that this particular culture of listening has developed around orchestral and classical music. And it's an event that shows both the exquisite acoustic refinement of modern concert halls, so that a sound as small and insignificant as a chewing gum wrapper can scar totally the experience of a Mahler symphony, but it also reveals how fragile the listening cultures of classical music really are. Think about it. In what other sphere of life would so tiny a sound have so great a social impact? Not in the theatre, not in the cinema, not even in a church service. And the violence of the reaction also shows how the community of the classical music experience of listening, of being part of a group of around 2,000 people sharing that Mahler symphony, has its limits. If we're honest, our inner personal feelings of sublimity matter more, at least they did to that bloke in Malmö, than allowing other people to do what they want or possibly need to. Live and don't let live is the message. Who knows why that gum was necessary? So our question on today's The Listening Service is, how did classical music come to this? That our concert halls and our audiences need to be so sepulchrally quiet that a single chewing gum wrapper can destroy a symphony? Because it never used to be like this. Instead of this, reverential silence with perhaps the odd rogue our concert hall soundscape as it is around the world today, your average auditorium, theatre or meeting place anywhere from 1600 to around 1920 would actually have sounded more like this. Now that seems like a direct contravention of all the prohibitive do-nots of concert hall etiquette today, which reduce our accepted range of responses to just two cattle-like behaviours. Bovine silence, as we listeners, self-loading musical freight in our concert halls, sit down and are very, very quiet. And then clapping, but only and only in the right places, at the very end of pieces. But this is all a parody of social convention, and it's a poisonous sense of prohibition that arguably has almost killed the art form.
I think it's terrible.
That's the voice of Richard Sennett, writer, historian and cultural thinker.
When finally people can release and clap at the end of a concert, they're clapping as much from finally being able to do something physical as actually what the concert is that they're hearing. So you can hear people going, bravo, 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 to a really crappy performance, just because finally they can make some noise.
More from Richard Sennett later in today's The Listening Service. Up until the 20th century, this wasn't the case in classical music. And in other musical cultures, pretty well every other musical culture, it still isn't the case around the world today. In folk music, in jazz clubs, in rock gigs, there is participation from the audience. We are all and always making some noise. That's how the performance works. It's an interaction between us listening and the audience, or the stadium, or the club, wherever we are, and the musicians on stage. But for the vast majority of the classical repertoire, well, it was written not for the farmyard passivity that we're now reduced to, but for listening cultures that are much more like those of other musical genres today. Instead, we were involved as listeners, and silence was only one of the options available to us. We would encore movements. We clapped so vehemently after the scherzo or the slow movement or the first movement of that concerto or symphony that the orchestra up there would just have to play it again. And we'd exclaim, holler and participate in the performance as it was going on, not only the end of movements, but within them too. Did you hear that clarinet solo? Gorgeous. God, the way she did that horn solo at the start of the second concerto of Brahms there, unbelievable. Mind you, that tenor cracked his top note, didn't he? Oh, those double octaves in that cadenza. How'd she do that? We were performing too. We as listeners were part of the theatrical event of the concert, participating visibly, noisily and energetically in the experience. These weren't works to be approached in the same way that we go to a funeral or a library in reverence and deference. Instead, these pieces of music, from Lully's operas in the 17th century to Mahler's symphonies to Stravinsky's ballets in the 20th, didn't and couldn't exist without us and our reactions. They weren't, and they still aren't, independently existing musical works, but rather they're staged events that require our participation. And that's what all musical cultures are. And despite the best intentions of the Hannibal Lecter-like forces that have tried to silence we listeners, that has to be true of classical music culture again too, if, that is, it's to survive. Now, the picture I've just painted of earlier participative listening cultures is so unfamiliar to us if you've been to your local concert hall recently that you might very well think that I've lost the audience applauding plot. But I have evidence, I promise. In a moment, we'll hear from James H. Johnson, the author of a compelling study of the history of listening called Listening in Paris. In this powerful and probing book, James H. Johnson describes the listening environment of the Paris Opera on any given evening in the 17th and 18th centuries. We're going to hear his voice soon, but what will we find? What will we hear at the Palais Royal? Well, he says we definitely have arrived late if we were any kind of self-respecting members of the audience. And in the parterre, what we now call the stalls, only men allowed down there. They're all standing up, lackeys and young bachelors and soldiers. As we move up through the echelons of the balconies, you discover worldly abbés, James H. Johnson says, chatting happily with ladies in jewels. All kinds of social and sexual shenanigans that are being staged all around us. More important than the performance on stage. And right at the top, the third balcony, was a place called the Paradise, Le Paradis. And this is my favourite misnomer of all the phenomena of the Paris Opera at this time. It was very dark up there, a good place if you wanted to get it on with a paramour, but it smelt terrible thanks to the wooden tubs, the loos and closets that were stationed all around the Paradise up there. All of this, of course, had an effect on listening, or rather, not listening. Here's James H.